Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin arrahmanirrahim maliki yaumiddin iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in ihdinas siratal mustaqim siratal ladzina an'amta 'alaihim ghairil maghdubi 'alaihim waladdallin amin. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Fazli bin Shamsuddin. My matrix number is AP190421. Today, I would like to present about my subject, which is a principle of economics, which is BPA 12403. I'm from section 2 in my class. I'm from section 2. Okay, I would like to introduce my lecturer's name. My lecturer's name is Association Prof. Dr. Pamawati binti Ibrahim. Today, I would like to present about the fiscal policy during a pandemic, which is this is my article, or this is our article. Okay, before we start, we must know what is fiscal policy. Okay, as we know, fiscal policy is the means by which a government adjusts its spending levels and tax rates to monitor and influence a nation's economy. Next slide. Okay, my part is only two part, which is I would like to present only two part, which is abstract and introduction. First, I will present about the abstract. What is abstract? Abstract is the article is we study the impact of the 2019 and 20 coronavirus in Malaysia and subsequent fiscal policy response in economic. The fiscal policy targets are related to government spending and taxation, while the monetary policies are related to interest rates, liquidity, and control of money supply. In terms of fiscal policy, the government has announced a series of economic stimulus package to help individuals and companies affected by the COVID-19 crisis. Because of this, pandemic will also make a discussion about the government can use a fiscal policy by referring to the government expenditures and tax. We also discuss a solution, which is using a supply-side fiscal policy to recover the economic growth during the pandemic. During this pandemic, the government's fiscal and monetary policies complement one another and will help to revive the economy by increasing aggregate demand such as public and private consumption and investment. This will help to stimulate economic growth through the multiplier effect and reduce the hike in the unemployment rate. Okay, next slide is introduction. Introduction is what is intro the article about. Okay, the first point is by now it is clear that this pandemic will have intensely damaging effects on both the Malaysian's macroeconomy as well as on the economic welfare of the people. The main source of economic damage in Malaysia are twofold, which is the first is the knock-on effect from the impacts of the coronavirus abroad. The second is generated domestically due to the newly imposed movement control measures. Second point is, in Malaysia, the effects of these China shocks may be dire. The Malaysian's economy is amongst the most highly exposed economies in the region to both Chinese demand and supply. China is Malaysia's number one trading partner, a large source of foreign investments, and its top tourist source outside of ASEAN. Okay, next, in the face of COVID-19, the government must focus on two objectives. One, focus on the necessary protective and safely pre-action to break the chain of infection, and two, they reduce the negative economic effects by implementing recovery policies and involving active fiscal and monetary policy targets. Next, the fiscal policy targets are related to the government spending and tax, while the monetary policies are related to interest rates, liquidity, and control of money supply. There are a few solutions, which is using a supply-side fiscal policy to recover the economic growth during the pandemic. During this pandemic, the government's fiscal and monetary policies complement one another and will help to revive the economy by increasing aggregate demand such as public and private consumption and investment. This will help to stimulate economic growth through the multiply effect and reduce the hike in the unemployment rate. Okay, yet the economic, social and political cost of inaction or even insufficient action is far greater and far more frightening. Surely, there is no time to be timid in the light of the emerging risk. It is clear that the fiscal policy needs to go further beyond the February stimulus package in safeguarding the livelihoods of the people. After all, the current COVID-19 crisis will eventually be conquered through vigorous public health efforts, but without a sufficiently large and forceful fiscal response, the economic scars it leaves will be visually long-lasting. Okay, that's all from my part, which is abstract and introduction. Thank you. And another part, my friend will present it. Thank you. That's all from me.
So today I want to explain about how COVID-19 can give the impact on our economy. As we all know, Malaysia are affected by a coronavirus or COVID-19, which is originated from a wet market in Wuhan, China. It is categorized as a pandemic by World Health Organization, and it can give the big impact on our economic structure, which is in unstable state right now. First, COVID-19 can give the negative impact on the labor market. In Malaysia, the unemployment rate is increased 3.9% in March 2020 because most of the people are unable to go to work or run their business due to the Movement Control Order or MCO. The Movement Control Order, the production and operation failures is occur and have to stop. Most of the company are unable to pay the worst of wages to their employees beyond the 2 months. Meanwhile, 67.8% of the company cannot even make any profit at all. There are two factors of unemployment rate during this pandemic, which are the company want to cut their cost of paying the wages to their employees to stay survive, or probably the company cannot survive anymore and have to stop their operation. Most of the business had to face the increase in cost, falling in revenue, increasing the pressure to service their debt. As the result, they begin to lay off their workers across many industries. In addition, the newly unemployed or fresh graduate is difficult to find a new job during this pandemic and make the average length of unemployment for workers is because during the pandemic, most of people will staying at home, so the demand of the household will be increased, but they are decreasing in supply due to limited resources. And during the pandemic, government decide to decrease their tax of fiscal policy. In this case, people will have extra saving and invest their money to buy their needs, but due to the limited resources, government cannot give the sufficient supply. As we know, tax is the main income for the government, but when they decide to decrease the tax of fiscal policy, it means they will decrease their income. In this case, government cannot afford the expenditure, cause them to borrow the money from the MTS and government investment issue. But if the debt is still increased or getting more worse, the government has no choice than need to borrow the money from the other country.
Moving on to our discussion is about how the government sustained the economic growth during this pandemic by using fiscal policy and referring to the government expenditures or taxes. Both of these components influences the economic activities such as promoting price stability, full employment, and economic growth. This pandemic is known as long-term rent because it determines long survival of businesses. In this situation, the government should use expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy consists of increasing the government spending, cutting taxes, or increasing the government spending and cutting taxes both at the same time. The graph studies that using government spending and cutting taxes can increase the aggregate expenditures. Increasing government spending and cutting taxes can be used to combat a recession. From the graph, we see that Malaysian economy has fallen into recession at equilibrium point E0, where the aggregate demand AD0 intersects with aggregate supply AS0 on price level P0 and national income, which is Y0. The curve aggregate demand for the year before moved to the left and become aggregate demand for the current year because of the changes made. The increase of aggregate demand causes the equilibrium point to reach E1, where aggregate supply for the year before intersects with the curve aggregate demand for the current year. The combat recession because of the pandemic can be solved, whereas the employment range increases from the national income from the year before to the current year. But the economy will face inflation when the price level increases from the year before to the current year. The next solution is by using supply-side fiscal policy to recover the economic growth during this pandemic. Supply-side fiscal policy emphasizes government policies that increase aggregate supply in order to reach long-run growth in real output, full employment, and lower price level. It is known that supply-side fiscal policy focuses on creating a better climate for business. Businesses can benefit from this policy to hire more workers that can decrease unemployment and create more jobs to boost the stability of economy. The graph shows that supply side uses some combination of cuts in resource prices, technological advances, tax cuts, subsidies, and regulations reduction that will shift the aggregate supply curve from AS0 to AS1. As a result, equilibrium in the economy will change from E0 to E1, and real gross domestic product will rise from Y0 to Y1, but the price level drop from P0 to P1. Supply-side tax cut influences the labor market, as we can see from the graph. The intersection of the labor supply before tax cuts and demand curve determines the equilibrium at point E0. The wage rate is P0 per hour with Q0 hours of labor per year. By lowering tax rates, supply-side fiscal policies increase net after-tax earnings. This extra incentive causes workers to provide additional hours of labor per year. As a result, the labor supply curve increases and establishes a new equilibrium at point E1. The new wage rate paid by employers falls to P1 per hour, and they utilize Q1 labor hours per year. The rationale behind this is so that the workers would want to work more hours to gain more money and to avoid unemployment, especially during this pandemic. They would really like to keep their jobs, so they are willing to work more hours, or you can say overtime. Furthermore, during this pandemic, the debt will also increase due to the increase of government expenditures and tax cuts. How do the government finance the debt? They do it by borrowing from the Malaysian government securities and government investment issues that is monitored by the Malaysian Treasurer. These government securities are considered safe havens for idle funds and are purchased by the central bank, government agencies, private bank corporations, individual citizens, and lastly, foreigners. The public debt has increased over the years in Malaysia, and it is not new if it becomes worse in the future because of this pandemic. The government debt affects the crowding out, which is a reduction in private expenditures, and causes the government to borrow money from other countries. The results of this crowding effect will be less consumption and less business investment towards Malaysia. It will worsen the relationship between Malaysia and other countries. At the end of this discussion, we know that this pandemic causes unemployment and the increasement of debt that leads to recession of the economy. But this problem can be solved by using fiscal policy for long-term run in business, although we know it has some side effects.
My part, I will continue with my conclusion from overall our assignment. So, to conclude our assignment, economy, I will conclude with the fiscal policy response to the pandemic has been apprehended. Urgent measures are being taken, which are likely to lead very large fiscal deficit. The response will have to be refined and adjust over time as a function of both the pandemic dynamic and our improving understanding of the issue. The purpose of this article is to think about the best design of fiscal policy, both now and in the near future. In this crisis, fiscal policy should have the three goals. For the first is to fight the virus. The second, to provide disaster relief to ensure the people do not suffer from hunger and firm do not go bankrupt. The third is to adjust aggregate demand to stay as close to potential output as possible. Each of these three dimensions come with its own set of challenges and difficult decisions. Such policy will result in a large increase in debt relative to GDP. In most advanced countries, interest rates are likely to remain low for a long time. So, despite this increase in debt ratios, debt should remain sustainable. The same cannot, however, be said of several emerging markets and developing economies. These countries should be helped so they can spend what they need to spend to deal with this crisis. Forcing them to spend less will be wrong and dangerous for others. They will therefore need grant and loan, both by international institutions and individual advanced economy, which themselves have to spend to save their own economy. These are two dimensions in which coordination across countries is essential. Help for emerging market and developing economies is of the essence. Looking down the road, coordination in the purchase and allocation of the test and vaccine is equally so. But coordination of fiscal policy is not essential. Put another way, if each country focus only on this domestic goal, the country will outcome will be fine. That's all from our group economy. Thank you, madam or Dr. Fatmawati.